Before we begin this podcast, please be advised that the following episode contains language that some listeners may find offensive and inappropriate. The opinions expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not reflect the views of the podcast producers. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to another episode of Voices of a Killer. Today's story is a story of a man whose life spiraled out of control, leading to the tragic deaths of his wife and infant son. Christopher Piersee, a man whose life once seemed like it was on a steady path, fell into a destructive cycle of drug use, specifically Coricidin, an over-the-counter cough medicine known for its hallucinogenic effects when abused. His struggle with addiction and the psychosis it induced led him down a path that no one could have anticipated. In today's episode, we'll hear Chris's account of what happened the night he killed his family, his reflections on the devastating impact of his actions, and the role drugs played in his deteriorating mental state. We'll also explore the legal proceedings that followed and how, ultimately, Chris ended up in prison. By the end of this episode, you'll also hear something unexpected, something that surprised even me during my conversation with Chris. Stay with us as we dive deep into a story of loss, addiction, and the search for meaning after unimaginable tragedy in this episode of Voices of a Killer.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
Chris.
an offender at the Jefferson City Correctional Center.
This call is from a correctional facility and may be monitored and recorded.
To accept charges, press 1. Thank you for using Securus. You may start the conversation now.
Chris, I did some reading on through the news and your crime and stuff like that, and some of the headings start off with gruesome murder scene described at preliminary hearing for you. Do you consider it gruesome?
Yeah, I would definitely have to say so. A lot of what I saw when I left, it was a blur.
Yeah, we can easily say that what you did was violent. I want to know, did you grow up in violence?
Yeah, I grew up as weird. Part of my life was real peaceful and real awesome. I had a grandma and grandpa who were real good to me. I had my mom who was real caring. I didn't know my dad growing up. And when I was 7, my mom met my stepdad, and he was definitely violent.
Your stepdad?
Yeah.
Who'd you primarily live with?
My mom and my stepdad. But I spent the summers in Iowa with my grandparents.
Where was your biological father?
I didn't know back then, but I actually have just recently gotten in contact with him, and it turns out he was in Texas.
Okay. So what does he think about your situation? Does he feel like he wish he'd been in your life or what?
He had a little more insight into some stuff. I guess he had asked around about some stuff before we ever got in contact with each other. And he understands that this was an accident, that it was terrible, and I'm not denying that the accident was my fault, but at the same time,
right,
he understood it was an accident.
What kind of violence did you see from your stepfather?
Really, it was weird because he treated my mom pretty good, and he treated my little brother pretty good, who was his biological son. But he really seemed to look at me almost as maybe the reminder that my mom had been with somebody before him. And so the worst of it was emotional and a lot of screaming, a lot of yelling.
So you didn't really get any love from him, and you saw him give it to his son and your mother, basically?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, yep. Definitely. And there was also quite a bit of physical violence. But like I said, the worst of it was the emotional side. That was the stuff that kind of stuck around the longest, I think.
Did y'all live in the state of Missouri growing up?
No, I actually never lived in Missouri until just a couple months before the crime happened.
Where'd you live?
We bounced around Illinois, mainly. We kind of lived all over the place, but mainly in Illinois.
Yeah.
Moved to Robinson, Illinois when I was real young.
Yeah. What kind of work did your mom and your stepfather do?
He did like different factory jobs, like factory management. And he was actually the reason we always wound up moving, because he was always looking for, it seemed like he was always looking for the bigger, better thing.
Sure.
And then my mom, when I was real young, she did some factory work and things like that, but she ended up also getting involved in different types of management in different companies. Actually went on to be really pretty successful.
Yeah.
It was an interesting thing to see from her.
Chris Piersee's childhood was a paradox, caught between moments of peace and the shadow of violence. He spent his early years in the care of his loving mother and grandparents, who provided a nurturing environment filled with affection and stability. Summers in Iowa with his grandparents were a refuge, where he experienced calm and a semblance of normalcy. His mother, despite her own challenges, showed him care, shielding him from the absence of his biological father, whom Chris never knew growing up. However, this sense of safety was shattered when Chris's mother remarried. His stepfather introduced a new reality marked by emotional and physical abuse. Though his stepfather treated his own son and Chris's mother well, Chris became a target, almost as though he was a living reminder of his mother's previous life. The emotional wounds inflicted by his stepfather's neglect and cruelty lingered long after the physical scars had healed. Despite these harsh conditions, Chris navigated his youth, moving from place to place, mostly in Illinois, following his stepfather's constant search for better job opportunities. Now, as Chris reflects on his past, he speaks not just of the hardships, but of moments that brought him solace. One such moment was when he met the love of his life, Patricia "Tish" Yarbrough, in 2007, a relationship that would change the course of his life.
Let's try to figure out, you're growing up, going through life, and then you get to a position where you're ended up killing two people. At some point, you're growing up, you have some turbulence with your stepdad and stuff like that. Did you end up getting into drugs and alcohol?
Yeah, I think that the high school age sort of stuff, I don't think it ever really surpassed your typical kid stuff. With occasionally I might drink at a party, or I might smoke a joint at a party or something like that. Honestly, I didn't have any kind of real drug habit until probably about a year and a half before everything happened, and around the time my grandpa passed away, when I would have been about 23.
How did the victim is your wife, and obviously your son, and your wife was Patricia. How did you meet her?
I had moved up to Iowa, back where the town that I was actually born, where I had some family and stuff. And I met her going to a party one night to pick up my cousin Courtney, who had called me and asked for a ride home. And I went over there and knocked on the door, and Tish answered the door. And it was just one of those moments where things just clicked. And I always laughed, and she always thought this was funny, that I used to consider myself kind of a smooth talker when I was young, talking to girls and stuff. Mm-hmm. And she opened the door, and I looked at her, and immediately the first thing I said was, "Is Courtney here?" And she just started laughing, and I was sitting there stammering and everything, but she invited me in, and we became friends. And it was a few months after that we ended up going out.
Yeah. So you guys meet, did y'all hit it off pretty quickly?
Yeah, I was just getting out of a relationship, and so was she. So we intentionally didn't really let anything happen right away. We just stayed friends for a little while, but we both had already talked about how we planned on being together. But I think that we both wanted to give ourselves a little bit of distance between the bad relationship she was getting out of and the not necessarily bad relationship I was getting out of, but just the relationship that had turned into a lot of jealousy and stuff like that.
Up to the point before you met Patricia, if I were to ask somebody what kind of person you were, what would they say?
I'd probably tell you I was a pretty friendly guy. I mean, I tended to get along with people for the most part. I didn't really have any enemies or anything like that. That's one thing. Even my mom always talks about is like going to school and stuff. I typically did pretty terrible on my grades and stuff, but all of my teachers would always tell her that I was just such a friendly kid, a pleasure to have in class. They just wanted me to do better on my work.
And how old were you when you met Patricia?
I was 22.
How old was she?
She was 19, about to turn 20.
And what state were y'all in when you met?
We were in Iowa, but it's right on the border of Illinois, and she was actually from right across the river in Illinois.
How long did it take for you guys to get married?
Let's see. We started going out in May and got married in November.
So the same year?
Yeah.
Did you feel like it was a mistake getting married? Was it the right thing or what?
I definitely didn't feel like it was a mistake. I think that some people probably thought that we had decided to get married because she got pregnant, which that really wasn't the case. We had actually decided to get married, and it was probably about maybe 3 weeks to a month later that she found out she was pregnant.
At the time that you guys get married, were you into kind of drugs or anything?
When we got married, by that point, yeah.
What kind of drugs?
Really just weed.
Oh, just weed?
Yeah, I drank a little bit, and I smoked weed.
What about her?
She drank a little bit when we first met, but for the most part, stopped by the time we were getting married. She stopped when she got pregnant, but even after she had the baby, she wasn't much of a drinker.
Yeah. Did y'all at any point move before the baby was born?
Yeah, she had a miscarriage with the first pregnancy.
Okay.
It was actually the first night that we met, but the first night that we spent together was actually the night that my grandpa passed away, which I found that out 5 o'clock the next morning, and we got a phone call. And he was a big part of the reason I had moved to Keokuk, Iowa. And after he passed away, my mom recommended that we move up to Burlington, about an hour north. So I ended up moving up there. And like I said, that was when me and her first kind of got together, and she came up there with me.
And she has a miscarriage. You guys move. What kind of work are you doing then?
When I moved up to Burlington, I worked at a grocery store and a deli.
What'd she do?
At first, she worked at a Family Dollar, and then she got a job at Kohl's up there.
Do you guys ever have any big fallouts? Cops called and stuff?
No, there was when everything happened, there was actually a news report that said that we had the cops call to our house one time or something, and then they ended up correcting that story because it was the same address, but it was actually her dad's ex-wife that had a big fight. The cops had got called 2 years before we ever lived there.
I think that article's still up like that I read one of them, and it said something that y'all had previous problems where the cops had domestic disturbance or something like that. So that kind of shows you how the news is usually off. Yeah. But so you guys moved to Burlington, life is going on. Did you guys get pregnant again?
Yeah, it wasn't too long later. And at this point, I think that I was starting to spiral a little bit.
Why?
Losing my grandpa had been a pretty big hit. Like I said, that was my father figure growing up. That was the only real father figure I had. And so that was hard. I guess a little bit of consolation when Tish got pregnant, that almost a feeling of I've lost somebody so important in my life, but now it's the next chapter in life and everything. And then the night she had the miscarriage, it was such a horrible thing. She wasn't feeling very good that day, and I had set up a whole little bed and everything out in the front room so that we could lay down out there and watch movies and stuff or bought some snacks. We were going to have just this kind of nice romantic sort of night in. And it was honestly, it was turning into a great night. We were going to movies, we were just having fun. And when she got up and went to the bathroom, and she came back out, had blood on her hands, and was just about to burst into tears. And you could tell she was locked up. And we called 911. They told us there's they can do, and essentially said, you're just going to have to see her OBGYN in the morning.
Okay.
We had to go and do that in the morning, and this woman this was terrible. She was so cold about it. Like, she never even came in and told us, like, hey, you had a miscarriage or anything. She literally just walked in and said, sometimes this happens. Sometimes pregnancy is just no good, and the body just gets rid of it, so you'll be fine. And Tish broke down, obviously. I did too. And then one of the worst parts was that she told us that if Tish passed the fetus, that she wanted us to save it and bring it into her because they needed to do some kind of test to make sure that everything was okay. And so that was how we spent the rest of the night, her waiting on that. And so she did at my mom's house later that night. And I remember, this is one of the worst memories I've got, but I remember having a bread bag and pulling it out of the toilet and everything. I remember it just felt like everything in me just broke. Like, my heart broke. I felt like everything was over. You know?
What was give me a size comparison? What you had to, the specimen of what you had to bring back to the doctor?
You said a size comparison?
Yeah, like how big was it?
Probably, I'm trying to think, maybe about as big around as maybe a little smaller than a golf ball, but not all the way round.
Was that pretty emotional doing all that?
Yeah, that was horrible. That was actually something that I pretty much never really talked about again, but never got out of my head.
Miscarriages are among the most emotionally traumatic experiences for any couple. The profound grief that accompanies such a loss can leave lasting scars, often creating an emotional void that is difficult to heal. For Chris and Tish, this heartbreak was particularly devastating. Having eagerly anticipated the arrival of their first child, their excitement was shattered in an instant. The moment when Tish returned from the bathroom with blood on her hands was a horrifying precursor to the news that would follow. Their baby was gone. The emotional weight of that moment, combined with the silence that followed, was overwhelming. It became a pain that Chris carried with him, never fully speaking about it again, but never able to forget. Amidst this emotional turmoil, Chris found himself spiraling. The loss of his grandfather, who had been his father figure, coupled with the miscarriage, left him in a fragile state. It's not uncommon for individuals to turn to substances as a means of self-medication during such distressing times, seeking escape from the overwhelming grief and emotional instability. For Chris, drugs became a way to cope with the internal chaos that he struggled to process. The weight of his emotional pain, compounded by his past trauma and lack of stability, sent him down a dangerous path. Little did Chris know, that path would soon lead to a series of events that would turn his life upside down. His struggle with emotional trauma and drug use was about to take a dark and irreversible turn. We find out more about that after the break.
So y'all get past that sad stuff. What happens after that? Do you guys try again or move or what?
Yeah, we stayed in the same place, and I started getting high a lot more and drinking a little more.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't much of a drinker, but this was also back before weed was legal in most places.
So do you think you were passing on the same hostility that your stepdad, Pat, gave to you? Did you bring that into the marriage?
No, we actually got along really good. We didn't fight very much at all. This is one of the things I think that's always bugged me, is that Tish's mom had been in a lot of abusive relationships, and Tish was the kind of person that she was pretty dead set on the fact that she was never going to be the type of girl to be in an abusive relationship. We even when we had small disagreements, they were typically things that passed on the course of an hour and never really turned into much more than just your typical disagreement amongst a couple.
So you can truthfully say before this crime that you'd never laid her hands on her?
No, absolutely. Tish, she wouldn't have stuck around.
Yeah.
There's no way in the world. If I had ever so much as slapped her, she probably would have broke my nose and been out the door.
Yeah.
So, but
So where'd y'all go after that? What happened?
We got pregnant again, and we ended up almost immediately after having our son Landon, we moved down to Missouri because Tish's dad and ex-stepmom, the current girlfriend of her dad, they told us that they had basically still had a lease on a house down in Missouri. It was a pretty nice little house. And as far as rent stuff went, it was going to be really about what we were already paying for a small apartment. And so we went down there and took over the lease on the house.
How did her side of the family like you? Did you feel like they liked you?
Yeah, actually, me and her brother, we were friends, even though he was troubled. But he had probably a more serious drug habit than he liked drugs that were a lot harder than what I cared for.
Did he turn you on to it?
No, because if anything, he turned me off from it. He liked meth and stuff like that.
Oh, it's Missouri.
And that was just not something I was into. I just saw what it did to a lot of people, and it really kind of, and it also, I know it really broke Tish's heart. That was, another thing that really kind of put me off.
So you guys get settled into Missouri, and you have Landon. What's life like whenever she gives birth, and now you got a healthy baby boy, I'm sure?
Yeah, it was, honestly, it was amazing. I don't know, it was fun. It just felt like life was getting back to being good again. Landon was he was the cutest baby. I remember I was so scared right before he was born. You always hear about parents talking about the moment they saw their kid that he was the most adorable thing in the world and all this stuff. And I was so scared that I was like, what if I don't think that? I had this thought of, what if I don't have that feeling like they all talk about stuff? She had to have an emergency C-section. And as soon as they got him out and handed him to me, I just loved him so much. He was the most just adorable baby that you could ever imagine. And he was so good. He slept through the night. He was happy. He laughed about just the funniest stuff.
Yeah.
It was perfect.
Yeah. So now you're a father, healthy baby boy. It seems like your marriage is doing good, but you said something that kind of, it makes me have lots of questions. You said it was an accident, but there's one person with a gunshot to a head, and this little boy that you love so much is beat to death. Are both those two things accurate without going into the details?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't even know with Landon what exactly happened.
Despite the many hardships Chris had faced in his life, he still managed to find happiness when he and Tish eventually started a family. Their son Landon brought joy and a sense of purpose that Chris hadn't felt in years. Life seemed to be moving in the right direction for Chris. He was a father, they had settled in Missouri, and for a moment, it felt like things were getting back on track. The birth of Landon was a beacon of hope, and Chris found immense pride and love in being a dad, watching his son grow and laugh at the little things. But happiness for Chris would be short-lived. Beneath the surface, the pressures of life, unresolved trauma, and an increasing reliance on drugs slowly began to take hold. The spiral was already underway, though Chris might not have realized it at the time. Little did he know, a single mistake would soon change everything, leading to a tragedy that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the next episode of Voices of a Killer, Chris will tell us about the day that turned his world upside down.
If you want to find out what happens next, right now, you can sign up at patreon.com/voicesofakiller. There you can find bonus content, early access, ad-free listening, and access to our chat community. So go to patreon.com/voicesofakiller to sign up now. Your support is what keeps us passionate about bringing these stories to you. That's a wrap on this episode of Voices of a Killer. A big shout out to Sonic Futures, who handled the production, audio editing, music licensing, and promotion of this podcast. If you want to hear more episodes like this one, make sure to visit our website at voicesofakiller.com. There you can find previous episodes, transcripts, and additional information about the podcast. Lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your feedback helps us improve and reach new listeners. Thank you for your support, and we can't wait to share more stories with you in the future. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Toby, and we'll see you next time on Voices of a Killer.